Hey everyone, hope everyone's doing well and staying safe these days. Doing another motherboard review here. Been using one of AMD Ryzen's latest chipsets. This one's actually going to be the X670 chipset, a higher tier chipset for AMD motherboards. Now this one's still a mid-range motherboard here. Again, as I mentioned in a previous video, higher tier motherboards have actually been selling out to some degree, which is usually the other way around. Processors actually sell out. But here we are to get my hands on this one. Go ahead and do a quick review, a little unboxing, motherboard overview, and take a quick look at the BIOS as well too. Probably even do a little bit of a BIOS update and also install Windows on it, see how things just basically generally perform. So let's go ahead and get this opened up, installed, and ready to use. This is actually going to be the first motherboard I'm actually getting my hands on with the new X670 chipset over here for new AM5 AMD Ryzen CPUs. And I'm actually really excited to see what features it actually has over the B6570 chipset here. So let's go ahead and take a look at the back here, as we usually do. And usually has a lot of scribble here on the features and whatnot of this particular motherboard, the chipset, and basically just this particular mid-range of motherboard over here. You can actually see the back plate is actually built in, so that's actually really useful. And we actually do see some features listed here, how it supports, the latest generation of Ryzen CPUs, X670 chipset. Does mention the PCI Express slots. I did actually notice something a little odd here. So it does say PCI Express 4.0 X16 on the back, but if you actually didn't miss it on the front, it actually says here PCI Express 5.0 ready, graphics and NVMe only, which is a little confusing. It does actually say here that this is obviously M2 Generation 5, so that's pretty good. That top slot right over here is going to be your Generation 5. So if you actually do have a late Generation 5, I don't even think there's any available just yet. But when you do, that is the slot you want to actually put it in. The other slots are actually Generation 4, still amazing speeds, obviously. I definitely mentioned like 7,000 megabytes read and 5,000 megabytes write, etc., etc. This actually does have 6 SATA ports and a bunch of USB ports over here. You can actually see a little diagram of the rear of the motherboard here and all the inputs in the back, but I'll definitely be able to actually show you that on the motherboard itself. No PS2 ports here. Looks like a number of USB 3 and 2 USB-C ports, which is actually pretty interesting. It does also have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built in, Wi-Fi 6, which is always great. LAN 2.5G. Gigabit LAN, which is actually becoming basically a standard these days. There's actually even faster of 10 gigabit, but those are probably on the higher tier motherboards and actually have seen them, and hopefully we'll be able to get my hands on them as well too. So it looks like that's pretty much all the features here for the moment. 8-channel audio over here, and other little stuff here to actually see. So let's go ahead and pop this open, take a look at what's inside. This box does have a little bit of weight to it. Actually, it could just be the motherboard itself. Maybe not so much stuff. It looks like MSI has actually done away with the user manuals, and it looks like it's going to be the same case here. They actually do include, they do include a little bit of a QR code on the motherboard box itself on the back, and you can actually scan that to go ahead and download a PDF copy of your motherboard. So basically just less printing. Some little paperwork here that probably could have been just put in a PDF form here as well too. But to see what's actually included, looks like we have some little M2 related screwdrivers. These look like little riser screwdrivers to put underneath, depending on which screwdriver you'll be drive you'll be using. Got some screws here for the M2 drives. Looks like some more as well too. 2 SATA cables. This motherboard does have 6 SATA ports, but SATA ports and SATA drives are actually being used less and less these days. Looks like this actually does have a backplate that's not built in, so that's something to keep in mind. I originally was hoping it would be. A little surprised it's actually not. This is just basically what every motherboard is actually offering, unless you're buying a motherboard that's like under $150. So it's a little bit of a slight disappointment there. Some more screws here again, and your 2 Wi-Fi antennas that go in the back. let's go ahead and take a look at the board itself, since that's what basically we're all here for. And here is the board in all its glory, basically showing all the features I just mentioned, and I'll definitely go through a really good run through of the entire board itself. And you can actually see here the AM5 socket CPU. Obviously all the pins are now on the motherboard itself as opposed to the CPU. We can actually take a quick look at that real quick here. I'm gonna go ahead and remove this little protector plastic here. Very, for the most part, easy to remove. And get a nice little close view here of basically the pins there and the socket itself, the AM5 socket. So obviously be really careful with this. If you're not going to be using this motherboard for some time and you want to put it away for the time being or transporting it to another system, definitely a good idea to keep this handy as well too. If you ever had to RMA the board, I believe they do expect you to put this here. At least that's my experience using Intel based boards as well. So I can go ahead and put this back. So I'm just going to do a quick overview here of the motherboard and all the connections and features it actually offers visually over here. If you are going to be using an AMD CPU, Ryzen CPU that does have integrated graphics, you'll be using these two connections over here, one display port and one HDMI port here. If not, you'll be using basically whatever video card connections your video card has connected to the PCI Express slot right over there, which I'll go over in just a moment. Very likely this display port connection here does support daisy chaining, but it all basically depends on the monitors you'll be using, so that's something to keep in mind. Just to the right, we do have one USB 3 port over here, and just below we do have a USB-C port. Additionally, we do have an additional 4 USB 3 ports here. And a little further to the right, we have another USB 3 port and another USB-C port. These are actually becoming much more important these days, very likely. And you also do have the option to connect a little bit of a wired adapter that can actually split this into a number of USB ports if you actually choose to use that instead. A little bit more to the right here, we do have the Wi-Fi antenna connections. And finally, over here, we do have the audio connections for basically a channel. Green obviously being your your front stereo sound speakers, your 2.1 speakers, and just some other connections here for surround sound, and of course an optical out connection here as well. There's no PS2 port on this particular motherboard. First and foremost, looks like we actually do have a little 4-pin system fan connection. There's definitely going to be a number of these. Obviously, they'll support 3-pin as well too. You can actually see that little piece of plastic here that will allow you to connect a 3-pin. 4 pins are becoming much more standard, but you do have that option right there. Scrolling down onto the bottom, looks like we do have our audio front panel connections. If you actually do have basically a little headphone jack or microphone jack on the front panel of your computer, you can actually go ahead and connect that cable right over here. Very old-fashioned, but that connection's right there for sure. Just to the right of it, we do have a 4-pin RGB connection for basically connecting LED lights and being able to control it using the MSI software and whatnot if you actually choose to use that. There's additional connections here that are 3-pin and 4-pin. I'll go over those in just a moment. Looks like over here we do have 2 connections. I believe one of them is actually basically to do with some sort of a sensor controller. You can definitely look at the motherboard manual for additional details on that. Something that's not really used too much, but the connection is actually right there. A little bit further over here, looks like we do have some connections here. I do know one of these connections here is actually related to chassis intrusion. So that's something to keep in mind right there. Now those particular connections are not really used for the most part on custom built computers, usually on branded computers like Dell, HP, which basically will get a little warning every time you boot up if the case has actually been opened up and tampered with and whatnot. So that option is definitely there if you do actually have that and wish to use that option. This little 5-pin connector here, I'm actually not 100% sure, and the manual did not actually mention any details about it. So it's something I have to really look into. See exactly what that basically the functionality of that particular connection there is. A little bit further to the right, we do have 2 additional system fan connections, both of them 4-pin as well too. So obviously this motherboard does have a number of fan connections. I'm actually going to see a few more. and I'll go over those in just a moment. A little bit further to the right, we do have two traditional USB 2 ports right over here and here as well too. Now, you actually may not be using these connections unless you do have a front panel old-fashioned USB 2.0 ports, or you just want to add on like basically an additional add-on card to the back of the computer if you choose to do so. Now, there are some devices such as power supplies that does have a little cable that connects basically to one of these connections, and you can use it to actually go ahead and basically be able to use all the sensors like electric, voltage and whatnot on the power supply itself. So these are actually still useful to a degree, but personally I've actually not used them myself anytime recently. Further to the right, it looks like we do have a traditional USB 3 connection. There appears to be an additional one here, which you can probably already see right over here. So you actually have two of those. So basically you'll be able to connect a USB 3 blue ports, whether on the front or even on the back as well too. There are some little add-ons you can actually put 2 or 4 ports, in this case 2 ports, to be able to actually connect this directly to your motherboard, which is actually really useful. And obviously this is something that people are not a big fan of. These are basically your front panel connectors right over here. So your RED, your hard drive activity light, your power switch, your power LED as well too, reset button, and this 4-pin I believe is for a PC speaker if you actually want to hear all those beeps and blips when it comes to turning your computer on and whatnot. Moving along here, just turning the motherboard. As I said, there is an additional USB 3 port right over here, so you can definitely go ahead and connect that for a front USB 3 port access. This one's actually sideways, might be a little easier, just like the SATA ports. If you actually have access panels in your case right over here, like in the hole, this actually might look much more clean for cable management. So just keep that in mind, whether you're deciding what to use this one or this one, if you actually plan to use that connection. Further to the right up here, we do have 6 SATA ports. And as I mentioned earlier, SATA ports are really just not being used too much these days, but you do have the option if you plan to connect to basically an old-fashioned mechanical hard drive. I know I definitely do, and you can definitely use that connection as well. Moving along a little bit more to the right, we do have a very useful USB-C connection right over here. So this is actually for a front panel or a real panel as well too, if you want to go ahead and use that. And I definitely want to start using these. Very, very useful to have in the front panel to actually connect smartphones these days. Most of Android smartphones actually use USB-C, if not all of them. And who knows, I believe, I keep hearing that even some Apple devices might actually start using them in the future as well too. I actually have seen some tablets from Apple using these connections as well too. Right over here, looks like we do have a 24-pin, very standard connection right over here, so you can zoom in a little bit better. And this basically just has not changed in the decades for the most part. Previously, there was a 20-pin connector for power supply on the motherboard, but now it's basically a 24-pin. I believe it's just remained that way ever since. And since we actually have a good view of it, we have the 4 DIMM slots, DDR5 DIMM slots right over here. And you also can use them in dual channel configuration. Just be sure you put your memory chips in the right order and you use the correct slots. I'm actually going to open these up because those are the slots I'm actually going to be using when I put the 2 memory chips that I have in mind on this particular system here as well. Moving a little bit more to the right, we actually do have 2 additional system fan connections. There's a total of 5 that I've actually gone over. There's actually a few more here, so I'll go over those, but you definitely do have these. Very useful to connect front fans on these particular ports here. Looks like here we do have a 3-pin RGB connection. It's not really labeled here for the most part, but I believe according to the manual, that is a 3-pin connection there that you can actually use. And additionally, up here, looks like there's another 4-pin connection here for RGB lighting. I actually almost missed it over here, but if you actually can briefly see those 4 little lights right there, that's basically your indicators when you're actually trying to boot up and the system isn't posting or basically just running through its diagnostics during the post process. You can actually see that one of them tells you if there's an issue with CPU, video card, memory, etc., etc. So very, very useful to actually keep an eye on those lights. Moving along here on the top of the motherboard, we have 2 additional fan connections. One of them actually appears to be let's see, a system fan, and the other one appears to be a pump fan. You can still use them for other purposes, obviously, but this one's very ideally used for pump if you do have water cooling or plan to use water cooling inside your system. And up here is the dedicated 4-pin fan connection for basically your CPU fan. Very useful to actually use that. And if you are using air cooling on your CPU, be sure you connect that directly there. Otherwise, your computer will start thinking there's an issue or a failure with the CPU fan. And you'll start seeing your CPU fan basically, or the fan connected to anywhere else, shooting up to maximum speed. And obviously, just might be a little bit tad annoying right there. Over here, looks like we have a pretty nice heatsink, pretty large heatsink right over here. Feels pretty solid, very useful just to keep things that are actually underneath cool inside, and basically just drag all the heat away from the particular item below. Further to the right over here, we actually have two 8-pin connections here that are dedicated for CPU power. As you know, this new generation of Ryzen CPUs are actually using more wattage, and I believe the minimum so far on the released CPUs at this time are about 105 watts, even for the basic 6-core CPU, which I actually did get my hands on. And obviously, if you're going to be overclocking CPUs, or there's new releases of more power-hungry CPUs hitting over 170 watts, you'll probably be needing both of these to actually be connected, but you actually do have them both available. Previous generations of motherboards may have had actually both of them, or even just one 8-pin and one 4-pin. In this case, you actually have two 8-pins, so that's actually something good to have in this case. I did already go ahead with take a look at these particular ports. I want to go ahead and just take a look at the motherboard itself. That's for the most part for the connections here, but I'm actually going to go over just a little bit on the motherboard right over here. You actually do see your generation 5, looks like that's what it says, Lightning Gen 5. Looks like a pretty nice double looking heatsink right over here. This is where your NVMe drive ideally was going to go to. You do have additional slots, one over here, and one down here as well too, so it looks like a total of 4. And these bottom ones will actually obviously be generation 4 connections. You do have a dedicated X16 slot, PCI Express slot right over here for your video card. Looks like you have another 16X slot. Actually, this one actually could be an 8 slot. And another slot just below here as well too, with another PCI Express X1 slot right over here as well. And additionally, I already went over it, but that's basically your AM5 socket right over here. And that's where you'll be installing your CPU. Heatsink obviously will go right on top and whatnot and all that stuff as well too. So it's basically a quick rundown of the motherboard right over here. I'm looking forward to really getting this installed and seeing what the BIOS looks like, how performance looks like, and basically how Windows 10 or 11 performance actually is running that processor and memory as well too. Let's go ahead and get this installed and take a look. Our system is up and running, and hope everyone enjoyed that build process there. I want to just mention, you may have noticed I actually use an AMD Ryzen Wraith stock cooler from a previous generation Ryzen CPU that I received and barely even used actually for the most part. You actually can use it. It is compatible, as you see. And the CPU temperature is actually pretty reasonable at a 42 degrees Celsius, etc. here. If you're going to be gaming or doing some video editing and whatnot like that, I do not recommend using stock cooler. You're going to be seeing CPU temps spiking into like the 60s and whatnot. And I can't even imagine what it's going to be like if you actually game as well too, especially with heat coming from the video card. So just a little FYI, I just wanted to point that out since I am actually using this more for just review purposes and whatnot. And a very easy CPU cooler to actually install. Throw on some thermal paste, 2 clips, and you're good to go. So here we are. Anyway, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button, support the channel if you're enjoying this video so far. Definitely got more motherboard reviews coming up, other reviews coming up as well too. So thanks again everyone for watching the video so far and for all your support over the last couple of years. Definitely enjoy your comments and whatnot. So let's go ahead and hit it here. So right now we're actually in the advanced mode here. I'm going to go ahead and click up here. You can actually also hit F7 to jump into easy mode. Basically MSI motherboards for the most part. Definitely all the MSI motherboards I've done reviews on and actually own myself. Usually have these two easy and advanced modes available to you. Other motherboard manufacturers like Gigabyte and Asus have their own words for it, but basically it's the same setting. Just jump between both of them. And the settings available to you will vary depending on which mode you're actually using. Here on the top left, you can definitely see the CPU temp at a whopping 4.7 gigahertz. DDR5 memory running at 4800 megahertz as well too, and I believe that's actually what it's set to. If it's not, you can definitely go ahead and mess with the XMP profiles here or just manually change the frequency yourself. Over here on the right, we do have some more details on basically your motherboard name, some core temperature over here, motherboard temperature as well too, CPU temperature, full motherboard name, your CPU, the 7600X 6-core processor, 16 gigs of RAM, and the current BIOS build date. I did actually look, and it turns out this board actually has the latest build date, so maybe maybe I was just lucky. It's not basically the first revision of the firmware, and there's actually no BIOS update to actually go ahead and install on this at this time. But I'll definitely go ahead and go through the process with you just in case you're curious to see that. Just below there, we do have a boot priority menu here. You can actually move all these around however you prefer, and just go ahead and control which boot device is your priority and which ones you actually want to go ahead and remove. In the advanced section, there's actually a different little method to actually go ahead and do that, and I'll demonstrate it. I will definitely demonstrate that to you a little later. Over here, as I mentioned earlier, we have some XMP profiles for the memory chips installed that are actually built in. Looks like there's one available for this one. You can definitely have some saved here for yourself. I can see 1 user, 2 user over here. And over here, it looks like a little bit of a button for like overclocking for the CPU itself. I'm just going to go ahead and not click on these right now though, but just go ahead and demonstrate that to you here. Looking at the easy mode menu here on the left under CPU, we do have basic information about your CPU, base clock, ratio number, voltage, and some other options here as well too. Obviously again, running at 4.7 gigahertz. Go ahead and click on memory. We actually do see the memory speed, 4800 megahertz here. We see out of the 4 slots, there's 2 of them, and both of them actually plugged into the ideal slots for dual channel, and that's correct here. It does mention again that this particular memory chips does have one XMP profile. You can actually see that it's basically 4800 megahertz with its clock numbers over here and voltage as well too. So definitely go ahead and turn that on if you'd like to go ahead and use it. Some upper class memory chips do actually have multiple profiles depending what you actually may be using it for. Moving along here, it looks like we do have an option for storage, which basically gives us a rundown of all storage devices connected to all SATA ports, as well as all the M2 slots as well here too. I did actually only connect one SATA hard drive, good old-fashioned Samsung A850 Pro, and you can actually see that connected here as well too. If you actually do have an M1 NVMe drive installed directly on the motherboard, you'll be seeing it here in the correct slot. Next on the menu, it looks like we have fan speed. It looks like it does give us some little details here on temperatures and speeds, current speeds of the fans in terms of RPM. You actually see the CPU fans running at a pretty low 900 RPM, basically. CPU temperature is still around 45 degrees Celsius, which is still pretty acceptable. If you go ahead and click on each button here, you'll see the associated fan. So here we do have under system fan 4 connection, we do have one of our system fans right over here, and another one here in number 5. So you can definitely go ahead and manipulate these numbers here as well too. The option to really fully manipulate these are actually in hardware monitor, and I'll get to that in just a moment. And the last option here is help, which once you go ahead and click on each one of these F keys here, it does take you to this particular hotkey and save section here. So definitely very useful to know here if you plan to use any of these. On the bottom of the screen, we do have M Flash. I'm not going to click on that, otherwise it'll actually take me to the menu and actually reboot the computer here. So let's go ahead and skip that, but I'll demonstrate that to you in a little while. Under favorites, we actually can go ahead and set up some hotkeys for a favorite section you actually have. And feel free to go ahead and set that up if you choose to do so. And hardware monitor, one of my favorite sections in MSI motherboard of BIOS systems, right over here, where you can actually manipulate basically RPM versus temperature. So basically your fan speeds against the current temperature that you have currently on your CPU or case. Go ahead and bring this up a little bit. You'll see that the CPU RPM increases accordingly. Looks like I actually gave it quite a bit of a speed right there, so I'll just go ahead and bring it down. And you can go ahead and do that to your system fans as well too. You'll see this will start going up as well. Very useful. Obviously you do see the graph here, so automatically the fan speed will increase as the temperature of the CPU or case increases as well too. To the right, we have some other options for FTPM. If you actually do plan to turn this off or you don't need it, you can definitely just go ahead and click. And there you go, it's basically on and off, very easy. Some other options here as well too. Looks like we do have the onboard sound as well. You can definitely go ahead and turn that off if you don't need it. And we do have easy LED control. You can actually turn that off also if you choose to do so. ACHI RAID and CSM UEFI boot modes as well too. So very little easy get-to-go settings to actually get you going on the motherboard, generally speaking. So if you really plan to do nothing else other than just tossing the CPU into the board, boot it up, change some things, this is basically your go-to menu. For others who want to go ahead and overclock and have more control over their system, or even enable or disable other stuff, you are definitely going to need to go to Advanced by just clicking on the F7 key, or just clicking up here as well too. And here we'll definitely demonstrate all the settings I possibly can go over. Quick little overview here. In the advanced mode, we actually do have the same menu on the top, basically your CPU DDR speeds over here, some temperature numbers, your boot priority menu, and also those options to actually go ahead and change the time and date as well too. I didn't mention that earlier, but it's over here as well. Hiding up here is also a little F12 key to actually take a screenshot if you do have a thumb drive plugged in. You can definitely go ahead and save some screenshots here to demonstrate, or basically to share or just remember settings if you like to go ahead and do that. Up here we also have some options to go ahead and change the language or search up here, basically just to go ahead and search some options if you actually go ahead and just manually search for as opposed to navigating all around. Go ahead and click on the little button that says settings here. We do have some options here. We can have system status. You can actually see some further options here. All the hard drives currently plugged in, SSDs, and some information on memory, BIOS build date, etc. Basically the information you have on the top here. You can go ahead and change your date and time as well. Under advanced, we actually have some other options here, basically a little bit more and thorough deep settings. One little option here that I like to usually click on is this one right here. We can go ahead and enable or disable onboard devices on this motherboard, such as basically the Wi-Fi module, if you'd like to go ahead and disable that. Some other options here, ACPI settings, USB configuration, integrated graphics control. If you actually are using the CPU with integrated graphics, you can actually go ahead and manipulate which would be a boot priority and which graphics you like to use, the onboard or a dedicated video card if you have one installed at the same time. USB configuration, some options over here as well as enabling legacy USB support. Power management setup, some other options here. BIOS CSM UEFI boot modes, where you can actually go ahead and choose which one you want to use. Wake up event setup right over here. Secure erase, which is really something for SSDs and whatnot. I'm not going to engage in it, but you actually do have option to erase, securely erase SSDs, which much easier and much faster to do than mechanical hard drives. I remember actually using programs like Blanco to actually wipe out physical hard drives, which can take hours, especially if you do more than one swipe. MSI driver utility installer, which is something very interesting. I believe this actually may be connected to actually getting some drivers installed shortly after an OS installation. Got to look into a little bit more into that option, but apparently it's enabled. Ask Media SATA support. Not really sure what this actually enables or disables, but the option's right there. Probably just go ahead and disable it too. There you go. And one last option down here is AMD overclocking. Obviously, any sort of overclocking you do on the motherboard can be a bit of a risk if you don't know what you're doing. Definitely don't go ahead and start overclocking. You can actually permanently damage your CPU, memory, or your motherboard as well too. That's basically it for settings. Let's go to OC over here. I'm going to try to go through a quick overview here, but you do have much more thorough settings here for overclocking your CPU and memory as well too. You also do have the option to manually go ahead and change your memory frequency right over here if you believe it's actually at the wrong number, running too slow, or even too fast. Some other options here, you can actually go ahead and click on CPU configuration. Now, just before this, I started filming this part of the video here, I did actually go ahead and disable these two options, Core Performance Boost, as well as Precision Boost Overdrive. The only reason I did that is because I noticed that the CPU frequency would spike along with the temperature, hitting around temperatures of around 60 degrees Celsius, which is a little warm for the most part. And just being in the BIOS, it's a little crazy to have that kind of temperature basically just browsing the BIOS. So I went ahead and just turned it off just for the sake of this video. You do have a lot of options here, so just be really careful. Voltage options here as well too. Again, if you are not really familiar with overclocking, I do not recommend you actually really change numbers here, with the exception of some basic numbers up here as well too. So just be really careful. We do have the same M-Flash option down here. Again, that just engages the M-Flash to go ahead and update the BIOS firmware. You'll need a USB thumb drive plugged into your motherboard to actually go ahead and engage that setting. On the right side, we have some other options here. Go ahead and click on OC profile. You can actually go ahead and save overclocking profiles here. If you've made a bunch of changes and you actually were just testing them or using them for different purposes, you can actually go ahead and save that profile over here, 1 through 6. You can even save them to a USB, or even load them from a USB as well too. So just something to keep in mind here. Very useful setting here to actually go ahead and have and be able to transfer and migrate to other motherboards and whatnot. Down here on the right, we also do have hardware monitor, which is basically the same hardware monitor here, fan speeds versus temperature, that was available in the easy mode. It's basically the same thing here. And under security, it looks like we do have some options here. This is usually actually a setting under advanced settings, but it looks like they made it a little different over here. We can actually go ahead and put an administrator password on the BIOS itself. You do have some options here for trusted computing, TPM. Currently it's disabled at this moment. Chassis intrusion configuration, there is that little connection on the motherboard to actually go ahead and plug in the hardware for that. And secure boot options as well too, if you actually want to prevent this computer from booting up from any other boot device other than the one you have it intended for. So that's just something to keep in mind there. So that's basically it here for the entire motherboard. Very useful settings here, and a quick overview of everything that's available to you on this wonderful X670 motherboard here for AMD Ryzen's latest generation CPUs. And the motherboard definitely does allow you to manipulate that CPU and use it the way you want it, you need it, and actually would really like to use it. Some further options can also be available as the BIOS firmware start to kick in, including supporting future CPUs, so definitely look out for that as well too. As promised, here we are in the BIOS firmware update section. Once you do have a USB thumb drive plugged into the computer here, you can actually go ahead and select it. It'll be appearing on this menu over here. If it doesn't, go ahead and plug it in and move it to another USB port and just hit this little refresh button here. You can basically go ahead and see it. Once you actually go ahead and see it, you see your thumb drive here, go ahead and open it up. Choose a directory. choose your file, and you'll actually see here it does give you the details of that selected BIOS file that you actually downloaded and be wanting to actually go ahead and install and update to it. So you'll see your current version and then the updated version as well too. So basically a really easy process. It'll actually ask you for permission to go ahead and proceed. You click yes, and the process usually takes in between 3 to 6 minutes. The computer will probably reboot itself maybe 2 or 3 times, and you should be up and ready to go. Definitely go ahead and jump into the BIOS just to make sure that your settings were preserved, or go ahead and change them again. Well, that's pretty much it for this motherboard review here, an entire build process. Good overview of the motherboard and an overview of the BIOS as well too, and all the settings as much as I could possibly cover as well. Actually go ahead and see the motherboard here, running pretty quietly for the most part, memory installed. Now in terms of LED lighting, I actually do not really see any LED lighting on this motherboard. Maybe a little bit on the top, but most of the glare and light that you actually see appearing here is really just more from the processor itself, the CPU cooler here, the processor cooler. And I actually do not see any other colors anywhere else, so I don't believe this motherboard really has much LED lighting, in case that's something that interests you. If you actually do want some, this motherboard definitely does have its share of connections, LED RGB connections, and you'll be able to actually go ahead and connect a lot of lights there as well, so really good options there as well. Hope everyone enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know if you have some comments or questions about it, if you actually got your hands on this motherboard and you have any issues or whatnot as well too. Go ahead and shoot that like and subscribe button. Definitely look out for more reviews and whatnot, and I will see you next time. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and as always, stay safe. Take care. Bye.